Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening to those of you outside the Washington area. My name is Suzanne Maloney. I'm the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. On behalf of the Foreign Policy Program and our John L. Thornton China Center, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event celebrating the book launch for my friend and colleague, Cheng Li. His new book, Middle Class Shanghai, Reshaping U.S.-China Engagement, is an incredibly important and timely addition to the study of China and U.S.-China relations. This is one in a succession of important new books from our Brookings China scholars this year. While many books on U.S.-China relations limit their focus to economic, strategic, or political aspects of the bilateral relationship, in his book, Cheng Li has probed deeper to examine the cultural, educational, and people-to-people ties between the two countries, ties that are often overlooked by policymakers on both sides of the Pacific. He argues that policymakers must not lose sight of China's internal dynamism and diversity, which can be best exemplified by the middle class in Shanghai. As Cheng Li writes, it was Shanghai that introduced the world to China, and it was also Shanghai that projected China into the world. So there can be no better lens for understanding the current dynamics and future trajectory of China than the middle class in Shanghai. He draws upon empirical research in the realms of higher education, avant-garde art, architecture, and the legal profession to highlight the strong and constructive impact of U.S.-China bilateral exchanges. Cheng Li will lead off today's event with a presentation of the book's findings, followed by a panel discussion among a phenomenal group of leading academics, including Deborah Davis of Yale University, Yue Ho of the University of Pennsylvania, and Elizabeth Perry of Harvard University. Our moderator today will be our Brookings visiting fellow, Jamie Horsley. In just a moment, I'll hand off the program to Cheng Li, but let me say a few words first about Cheng himself. Cheng Li is Director and Senior Fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. He grew up in Shanghai during the Cultural Revolution before coming to the United States to study at the University of California at Berkeley and then at Princeton University. He later returned to China on a fellowship to observe the grassroots changes in his native country, which resulted in his first book on the birth of the Chinese middle class in 1997, at a time when few recognized the significance of the Chinese middle class. By the time of his second book on the Chinese middle class in 2010, an edited volume published by Brookings, many Western academics still doubted the concept. With the release of Middle Class Shanghai, now 24 years after he published his first book on this topic, few can doubt the existence and the importance of the Chinese middle class. This new book's thesis about the transitory phase of this emerging socioeconomic force and the unsettled nature of China's political trajectory provides a unique perspective into the ongoing debate about U.S. strategy toward a global China. Cheng, congratulations on this masterful new book. I know we all look forward to your remarks. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that kind and generous introduction, and also for your leadership in the Brookings Foreign Policy Program and your clear-eyed vision for our research to address the challenges of a global China. I would like to join Suzanne in expressing my heartfelt appreciation to the leading scholars in China studies in the United States who will participate in our panel discussion: Deborah Davis, Yue Ho, and Elizabeth Perry. I'm so honored by your presence here today, and I truly look forward to hearing your expert insights and your candid criticism of my book. Thank you also to our viewers who are joining us live from around the world, including distinguished China watchers in academia and other circles, and my Brookings colleagues and also research assistants, former and current, and so great to see you. Now, this book has been more than a decade in the making, and you have helped me better understand China, one of the most complicated, contradictory, and consequential powers of our time. I'm immensely grateful and humbled to have you be part of today's book launch. Now, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I would like to share with you three main aspects of the book. Let me turn on my PowerPoint. Yes. Now I will cover first it's a thesis and the methodology. Second, debates and the development addressed in the book. And finally, the anecdotes and artwork therein. Now, let me start with the thesis as a methodology. This book, Thesis, runs contrary to prevailing views regarding the failure of US engagement policy toward China. There are a number of components. I just wanted to mention three. One is that viewing China as a monolithic entity with no distinction between state and society. The so-called a whole of society threat certainly represents such a view. Secondly, viewing the middle class as the political ally of the party state without recognizing the dynamism and the diversity of this new socioeconomic force and the transitory political role, this I will argue. And finally, viewing the large number of the PRC students and scholars in the United States as spies being weaponized by Beijing, and therefore assuming bilateral educational exchanges benefit only China and may even undermine American supremacy and American security. Now, the book's central question and argument I also just summarized here. The question is, if America disengaged from the forces within Chinese society, especially its dynamic middle class, what leverage and influence can the United States have on China's future evolution? So the central argument is, as the world's two major powers, each with a large middle class population, neither China nor the United States have the interest or the capacity to destroy the other. Both countries, therefore, need to find an entirely new way to coexist by reshaping US-China engagement. This is a subtitle of my book. Now, in terms of methodology, I just will be very briefly mentioned. One is the research methods, including a number of things, including statistics analysis, the elite background, biographical data among Shanghai elites with the municipal government, the universities, and also in some other major fields, and the political and the cultural discourse among Chinese scholars over the past decade or so. And also the book has two surveys conducted by Verizon company in Shanghai. One was conducted 2009, the other is 2014, basically focused on foreign educated returnees. And finally, it also has two chapters on China's avant-garde art, including some artwork. I focus on 5 artists in Shanghai, avant-garde artists. I will mention one later on in my presentation. Now, in terms of realms of focus, Suzanne already mentioned that included architecture and urban landscape, including municipal government, higher education, the composition of both administrators and college professors, and the legal profession, particularly law firms, including private law firm and foreign-owned law firms, and the avant-garde artists. Now, why Shanghai? This is part of methodology. Now, there are several reasons. One is understanding Shanghai is vital to understanding modern China. There's a famous Chinese saying goes like this: to learn about a 2,000-year Chinese history, one should visit Xi'an. To understand the 500-year Middle Kingdom, one has to see Beijing. To grasp the past 100 years of changes in China, one must look at Shanghai. There's also a book written by American historian Rose Murphy, published in 1953, has such a title, Shanghai, Key to Modern China. Now, secondly, Shanghai serves as a cradle of both the middle class and the foreign educated returnees These are the two groups I put a lot of emphasis. Now, in terms of foreign educated returnees, about 10 years ago, that the Shanghai constitute 1/4, 25% of returnees of the entire country. I do not have the updated data, but that was about 10 years ago. Now, also intrigued by with the multiple identities of Shanghai, namely local, national, and the cosmopolitan, they are all dynamic, mutually reinforcing each other, while also retaining independent value within particular contexts. Shanghai's cultural dynamics stress neither cultural clash or cultural convergence, but rather cultural coexistence and cultural diversity. Now, finally, Shanghai is currently the pace setter in China's new search for global power. And its role will shape how China will act and how the outside world will respond to the emergence of global China. Now, I recently wrote an article published in Hong Kong and talk about the two tales of a city that's referred to Shanghai, talk about Shanghai's contradiction. In terms of history, Shanghai was certainly the most westernized Chinese city over the past 100 years or longer. But Shanghai was also the birthplace of Chinese Communist Party and was the center of the Maoist radicalism. I grew up in this red terror of the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai. Now, in terms of present, Shanghai is a frontier city of market reforms, opening up, and cosmopolitanism. But paradoxically, Shanghai is also the head of a dragon, the Chinese leader used that term, in China's industrial policy and the state capitalism. So both are true. And in terms of future, Shanghai has been seen as a vanguard of the middle class worldly voices, views, and the values, which my book really try to explore these worldly voices, views, and values. I will share more later on. But Shanghai is also a showcase of China's growing aggressive global outreach, the so-called 5 centers. Now, this is the first. Now, let me talk about the debates and the developments. Because of time limits, I will not elaborate all these things, but only talk about the 1 or 2. Now, there's some different views about the definition and the composition of the middle class. Now, we're so fortunate to have the leading scholars and on the subject with us as panelists. China scholars certainly have different views on these in terms of definition and the composition, and also in terms of real number and the future expansion. There's an argument that the future will continue to expand, but also argues that it will be hit, according to some studies, like middle class elsewhere. Now, these are all debatable. I certainly cover this kind of document, this kind of debate within China, within Shanghai, within China. And also there's a debate about the social stratification in China and the group consciousness of the so-called, some people use the term so-called middle class. And whether this middle class has an internal cohesion, some scholars challenge such a cohesion. I will elaborate very quickly later on. But some people argue Shanghai middle class, like a Chinese middle class in general, do have shared values. And if so, what they are. And finally, probably most importantly for policymakers, is the political role and the relations with the China's party state. Now, these are the major debates. Let me share with you some numbers, the rapid expansion of the China's middle class. Now, by 2019, 40 years after China began its economic reform, nationwide, there has grown, GDP had grown 60 times large, and the per capita income 25 times higher. Now, that's a number certainly released by our Chinese government, but on the other hand, we do see a lot of evidence to show that all of a sudden that the Chinese middle class emerged. Now, GDP per capita has increased from about $1,000 in 2001 to 10,000 last year. And in the recent Chinese People's Congress meeting last March, they presented the so-called 2035 vision statement, expected that the middle class will, Chinese GDP per capita will reach 30,000. This is if that happens, is truly remarkable development. Now, also refer to Shanghai. 2 or 3 years ago, in 2018, 5 million registered households in Shanghai were regarded as middle-class families. This constitutes 91% of the total. Now, of course, this does not include the non-registered households population that I wanted to clarify. Now, also in 2019, the average value of the registered household assets in Shanghai was 8 million yuan, or about 1.2 million US dollars, based on a report of the People's Bank of China. Now, of course, this number certainly does not include migrant workers and their families in the city who cannot even afford decent rental housing. So this is the serious economic disparity and causes tremendous tension. But the registered households, it has high percentage, and also this has also raised the issue about the possible property bubble. I mean, people talk about Shanghai, but so far, I mean, people talk for almost 20 years, but still they're going up. But that's the number to share. Now, this is the chart I use in my book. Talk about both the GDP per capita, this is the blue line, also the urban household per capita in terms of disposable income. Both are increased really quite remarkably in Shanghai. Now, also there's one phenomenon documented by Dominic Barton and his colleague at McKinsey. Now he is a Canadian ambassador to China, Dominic Barton. Their study a few years ago already see or project the middle class will expand from major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, which accounted for 40% in 2002 in terms of total number of middle class, and jump to 16% 2022 next year. But the other cities from 60% in 2002 increased to 84%, including 45% in tier 2 and 41% in tier 3 cities, according to their study. Now, in terms of regional differences, middle class moved from the coastal region to inland region. So you can see the distribution change drastically from 87% in coastal region to 61%, dropped significantly. But at the same time, from inland region, 13% 20 years ago to about 39%. So that's the dynamic of the middle class. So many other cities, for Chengdu, Chongqing, and also even tier 2 cities, you see the rise of the middle class. Now, the middle class is not a homogeneous group. It's a diverse lot. My book particularly point out the 3 clusters based on their occupation: an economic cluster, political cluster, and the cultural and educational clusters. They are very different. But this raises question whether they should be considered a coherent middle class. Now, but I do believe that we can identify some of the shared values and attitudes, make them as a coherent group, despite the occupational differences and the different policy preferences in certain areas. Now, here's the list. I do not have time to elaborate. One is appreciate the middle class lifestyle that's shared. Property, protect the property, the private property rights. Otherwise, there's no such thing called middle class. Support the policies that promote education, advocate for measures that safeguard the environment, care deeply about food and drug safety, resent the government's great firework online. You know, no one praised that great firework plan. Even some of the low-level government officials, they wanted to access information. Now, demand government accountability and transparency. There's a lot of movements going on, and look favorably towards economic liberalization, because China differs from many other countries, including probably United States, because Chinese middle class benefited greatly from economic liberalization, but the U.S. middle class, do not or has not benefited that much. Only 20% of the top benefit. And finally, for Chinese middle class, they hold pride for China's rise on the world stage. Now, in terms of middle class political role and the relationship with the party state, certainly the book discussed about the theoretical proposition made by Western social scientists like Baltimore and many others. I do not want to go to detail because they argue there's a linkage between societal change and the political system. I actually believe that. I think the time is not arrived yet, but I strong believer that overall their thesis still stand. Although what happened in today's China certainly not in line, but again, the middle class, rise of middle class is still relatively recent phenomenon. And China's new middle class tends to emphasize the status quo, and it's a risk averse in political views and behavior, which I agree. But this again may be just a temporary and a transitory phase of the middle class development. Now, Chinese middle class favors socioeconomic stability. There's nothing wrong with that to a certain extent from their perspective. Now, American middle class also prefer socio-political stability, given many in China are familiar with two major events in 1990s. One is Japan's last decade of economic growth, and the second is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chinese government propaganda, really emphasize these two things that explain middle class view about socio-economic, socio-political stability. In the recent years, middle class protests or movements constitute the most important political challenges to the authorities. The most famous one is Li Wenliang, whistleblower, that the public opinion in February really caused tremendous challenges for the government. Eventually, Chinese authorities and central government changed the previous verdict about Li Wenliang. And so my argument is their role, middle class role, was, is, and will be influenced and constrained by situational factors, both domestic and international. Now, very quickly, talk about the foreign education, foreign exchanges. This is what for the entire country from 1978 to 2018. It's a really remarkable movement, the largest education study abroad movement in China's history. Now, this number may change and in the next few years, but this is overall, the orange line is the returnees. You can see also most of them return to China. And this is in the Chinese students and scholars in the United States, also in that same period. You see that really dramatic growth. And in terms of the percentage, Chinese students constitute 34% of entire foreign students. And this is the orange line. So the second one, a few years ago is Indian. It's only count 18%, ranked number 2. So that's the tremendous presence of Chinese students. Now, students sometimes are very nationalistic. Of course, there's multiple reasons for that phenomenon. Sometimes even you can say there's anti-American sentiment by returnees, by Chinese intellectuals in China. Now, but this is, we should not forget, there's some also external reasons, causes by some politicians in the United States claim that Beijing is weaponizing Chinese students enrolled in US universities, target the Chinese and the Chinese American scientists, consider termination of educational exchanges, employing the phrases like President Donald Trump, Chinese virus and the Gong flu, provoke xenophobia and anti-American hate crimes among some politicians or media people, and also restrict the members of CCP and their families, about 300 million people from visiting the United States. Now, these are the reasons probably help us understand, the current views of the Chinese students and returnees. But these views are not preconditioned, not fixed, not homogeneous, we should understand. Now, finally, I know that I only have a few minutes left. I want to talk about anecdotes and articles. Now, this is the photo that about 3 years ago that about the coffee shop. Let me share with you my personal experience regarding the acceptance of coffee in China. In the middle 1990s, that I took 2 years of long leave of absence from Hamilton College, where I was a professor. I live and work in Shanghai as a reporter for US-based Institute of Current World Affairs. I wrote reports, monthly reports, and including a couple of reports about the tremendous difficulties and that foreign retailers were facing in terms of selling coffee to Chinese especially high quality coffee to Chinese at that time. The point is that most people told me that Chinese prefer teas rather than coffee. There's no such a market now at that time. Now, one very successful Chinese entrepreneur, I quoted in my report that once asked me, what is a cappuccino? He never tasted cappuccino. He saw the Western Western novels talk about cappuccino. Some of his partners also asked, business partners in foreign countries also asked him about that. So an alumni at Hamilton College, the French owner of the Mr. Coffee, the brand name of Mr. Coffee, and actually saw the report. He mailed me a cappuccino machine to give to the Chinese entrepreneur, and I did. Now, it was then, this is now. You can see huge market, and not only in Shanghai, but also across the country in terms of coffee. So sometimes time will make a difference. Now, the next photo anecdotes I will share with you. Now, these photos show the Chinese people's admiration of Kirby Bryant. My book actually argued that we should not undermine or underestimate the profound impact of cultural exchanges and enduring friendship between peoples, Americans and Chinese, even at the time when the US-China relationship has drastically deteriorated. Now, this was evident in the widespread mourning throughout China that followed his tragic passing on January 27, 2020, the day after the helicopter crash that killed Kirby. Chinese always call him by his first name. There were more than 1 billion web searches for Kirby's name on Weibo, Chinese Twitter, more than double the number of searches for coronavirus. That was astonishing, given that China was in the throes of the deadly pandemic. Now, let me also share with you the anecdote about Jingxing Show, which is well known in China, but less so outside the country. The Jingxing Show was the highest rated late night talk show in China from 2015 to 2017. And the host is the transgender woman, a new Shanghainese, originally from Dongbei, and ethnic Korean, and a returnee from the United States. The recurrent theme of this Shanghai-based show was the introduction of Western ideas, social norms, progressive values, and the middle-class lifestyles trends to the Chinese public. Now, early this year, Jingxing took on a new role running Parliament by Lerman, a famous historical nightclub and dance hall in Shanghai, with a commitment to revitalize this cultural hub. Now, this anecdote and many others in the book reflect a high tolerance for different styles and approaches through Shanghai's Haipai culture, whether in the domains of art, architecture, literature, music, or the public discourse. And finally, I want to spend a couple of minutes discussing 3 pieces of artwork by Ding Yi, one of the most famous avant-garde artists in Shanghai. For over 3 decades, since 1988, Ding Yi has constantly indulged in the creation of series of painting experiments titled Appearance of Classes, in which he used addition sign and multiplication sign constantly. This is signature sign. His art is similar to the Chinese traditional plaid fabric, 格子布, the traditional, particularly in Shanghai. Interestingly, Mr. Ding's designs were later adopted by luxury fashion brand, Hermes, Chinese term 爱马仕, to create dozens of scarves. In a way, Ding's signature appearance of classes is an artistic fusion between tradition and modernity, East and West, and abstract and utility. Now, Ding Yi has been trying to extend his unique appearance of classes paintings to the 3-dimensional media such as the installations, sculptures, architecture, and more. Now, Ding Yi's 2011, this is 2011, he had the exhibition at the public sculpture outside of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And also 2012, 1 year later, his series called the Taiji, exhibited in Qingpu, Shanghai, conveying this message that when traditional images are enlarged multiple times, their meanings and their impression can change completely. Now, for Ding Yi, it is not just the West that should develop a more updated and balanced assessment of China or China's ongoing transformation, which is, of course, needed. Equally important, China also must better understand how its changing status may affect and be perceived by the outside world, especially the United States. Now, that's all for my presentation. Sorry for concluding this presentation with a commercial promotion for the book, but as a Shanghainese, I cannot escape the entrepreneurial Shanghai spirit in my blood. Now, I would now like to turn over to the program to my dear friend and colleague, and Jamie Hosley, who will moderate our panel with the distinguished academics who will provide commentary and the critique of the book. Jamie is a visiting scholar with us in the Brookings Thornton China Center, as well as the senior fellow and the visiting lecturer with the Paul Tsai China Center at the Yale Law School. I can think of no one with a more diverse and multifaceted background than Jamie. She has been an on-the-ground witness to China's development in various fields since Deng Xiaoping's impact on economic and reform and opening up. She has worked in cooperative government relations, law, diplomacy, and civil society. She has worked in, she holds a degree in anthropology, China studies, and the law. Her one-of-a-kind background, I would say, afforded her a unique perspective from which to guide today's conversation, which will undoubtedly touch on all of these areas and more. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cheng, for that wonderful and generous introduction. And good morning and good evening to everyone joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted that Cheng asked me to moderate this panel to discuss his very fascinating and important new book. I think Cheng himself epitomizes the high-pie Shanghai culture that he wrote about: pragmatic, entrepreneurial, as he said, innovative, pluralistic, modern, and forward-looking. The only characteristic I'd say he does not embody is leisureliness. Cheng is a veritable typhoon of energy and anything but leisurely. Very productive too. So today I'm serving as moderator, not panelist, but before introducing the others, I would just like to observe that from my own experience through the work with the Yale Law School China Center with Shanghai, I witnessed myself the role that it plays as an experimental zone and pioneer in the legal area, in areas like urban management and governance mechanisms. And they often try out, path-breaking new things in Shanghai, which then are elevated to national law and spread throughout the country. But today we've got other panelists here to go into more detail and give us their remarks on the book and the issues it raises. They will be speaking in alphabetical order, and I'll give you a brief introduction to them first. Deborah Davis is a professor emerita of sociology at Yale University, where she's held multiple leadership positions in her over 4 decades at Yale. She's currently a visiting professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, as well as on the faculty at the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And her ongoing research looks at the uneven development of Chinese cities and on marriage and housing experiences among Chinese generations born in the 1980s and 90s. Our second panelist will be Professor Yue Ho, who is a named assistant professor in social sciences in the University of Pennsylvania Political Science Department. Her research focuses on authoritarian institutions, business, state relations, the political economy of development, and ethnic politics. Her recent well-received book on the private sector in public office addresses a long-standing puzzle about how China's private sector manages to grow without guarantees of secure property rights. Our third, but not least, panelist is Professor Elizabeth Perry of Harvard University, who has particularly close ties to Shanghai, where she was born in the years before establishment of the People's Republic of China, to missionary parents who were also professors at St. John's University. She serves as a named professor of government at Harvard and is director of the Harvard Yanqing Institute. Her research focuses on the history of the Chinese Revolution and its implications for contemporary Chinese politics. She's received many, many awards for her writing and research, including for her book, Shanghai on Strike, The Politics of Chinese Labor. So each of our outstanding panelists will talk for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll open up an internal discussion among ourselves. And then we will invite Cheng to join us for a Q&A session with audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes. And for those of you who do have questions and did not send them in advance, we'd ask that you please send them to events@brookings.edu. Without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Davis.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I am going to be very brief, but I do want to say what an extraordinary book this is. It is so rich. There's no way that even the whole panel is going to let readers, the audience, know how much is in the book. And I also want to thank the organizers and Cheng Li for including me. It's an incredible honor because my own experiences in Shanghai since 1981, my first trip to being in the Shanghai Forum, speaking in September 2019, which is my last time in the city, means that as I go through this rich book, my own life is passing before me. And I did take out a couple of slideshows just to remind me. But there's also a person, I don't want to use this slide yet, please. If you could take that off, Ryan. I'm not ready there. So I wanted to say that Li Cheng himself has been an extraordinary introducer, a facilitator for me to observe and participate in Shanghai. And it goes back to the early 90s when he was there, as he said, as a journalist. And we met up to go to one of the very first job search centers, which at that time was a radical idea. And of course, transportation was extremely onerous, but we made it and we spent the morning there. And then afterwards, we went back and he showed me the home in which he had grown up. And so I want to thank him not only for this book, but I want to thank him because he personally has opened doors for me as an outsider to capture the dynamism of Shanghai particularly since 1992. And for me, as I will comment now, the 1980s was a special time. And if you spent time in Shanghai in the 1980s, that set a certain baseline against which you see what comes next. So I'm just going to make 2 observations about the book as possible starting points for today's discussion. The first is, I agree with Li Cheng that culture matters for everything. And that his use of the term cultural transnationalism is immensely helpful in sharpening and focusing our thinking about change in Shanghai over time, and also for understanding the crisis of US-China relations. That is, the cultural piece is as important as the economic or political, and these things are actually quite hard to untangle. However, I would challenge the equating in the book of Haipai Shanghai culture, let's say, with middle class. And he's already alerted in the PowerPoint that there is a debate. And I just want to illustrate that comment and then move on to a second point. And in the book, if you read the book on page 49, Li Chang makes a shout out to Wang Jianying and myself, a comment we made when they did the middle class conference. That was the earlier book. And I remain less willing to extend the boundary of the middle class to the majority of Shanghai. And now, Ryan, maybe we'll just quickly look at these two slides. The reason why I stress that is if you look at this simple graph about urban households in China in 2019, it's from Statistica, the middle is the middle 20%. That's the quintile. And whether we have olive shape or pyramid shaped distribution of income, the middle is the middle. And one can go up 20% and down 20%. But my main point in this slide is that the upper 20%, what's here called the high income, is the group that I think actually is the group that is most often the actors in the book and even in the PowerPoint. And then Ryan, if I could see the second slide just to make the second point. The second point is the one, this comes from the data on the next slide. If we can have the next slide.
I'm having issues. I'll get it up in a minute.
Okay, if it doesn't work, it's not important, but you can drop the slides. I'll just say what it says. The second slide is from data that was released in December. And what it does is emphasize the median income for households for the entire country. And what you see there is that in 2019, that was 26,000 for the median household in the country, and the middle 20% in urban was 37,000. So when we talk about the diversity, I would push, I think, Li Chang to think whether he really wants to stress so much middle class, and we'll just pick that up again. As he said, this is an ongoing debate. It's not going to be over. My second point, which relates to this, about observing the dynamism of Haipai society over this past 20 years, is the centrality of migrants. Rather than the middle class, for me, what is captured, the risk-taking, the optimism, the ability to transform not only their own lives, but transform the city around them, comes from the migrant experience. And migrants to Shanghai come from many backgrounds. And if we reflect on the educational world in which I live, and think about the people I have worked with and trained, and from starting in 1992, which was my first summer workshop, through last September of 2019, when I spoke at the forum and then spent 10 days in Shanghai reconnecting to as many friends as I could, most of them are migrants. That is, they came from small towns in Anhui and Zhejiang and moved up. Sometimes they moved up to go to a middle level university, and then they came to Shanghai. There were people from Dongbei that came to Shanghai. There were people that came from the west to Shanghai, and they all found a place in the city. And so to me, what's driving this extraordinary outsized growth and openness and cosmopolitan is, for me, very much, I don't want to say primary, but is the migrant themselves, but it's also the way the city of Shanghai has changed from 1992, well, certainly from the 80s, but even from 1992 over through 2020, where Shanghai, native-born Shanghai people began to embrace their migrant past. We are a city of migrants. And I contrast that to the last 5 years when I was teaching in Beijing. So I think the Jingpai Haipai distinction can, of course, it's too simplistic to capture the complexity. But if we just take those two cities, the cultural piece that strikes me as essential in understanding the key themes in this book is the openness and embrace of migrants. into the city's core. And for me, Shanghai represents that, and Beijing represents a place which is actually trying to, we know, expel migrants. And even when we think of Xiong'an, the creation of Xiong'an is so that, at least it was what I read and was told, that they could create a second city alongside Beijing where the high educated white Diren, the people without Beijing hukou, could be. And this was extraordinary, that it was so difficult to incorporate even Tsinghua Beida graduates as core members of Beijing society, that you needed to build another city. And then the expulsion of almost, at least 500,000 peddler, scavenger, lower manual labor migrants who are so vital to the society, again, is an example of how the capital city views the migrants in a very different way. And so for me, middle class will be there. But if I think about one of the really essential aspects of Shanghai culture in the current period, it's the embrace of the migrant. And then the last thing I'm going to emphasize is, given this pace and scope of the material transformation, which has erased the built environment of the 60s and the 70s, but at the same time, everybody over the age of 50 has a lived experience of their childhood and young adulthood that shape how they understand today's affluence and plenty. And I would argue that these memories also shape their ambitions for the future. Moreover, I would stress that the memories of the past not only inform current expectations, my former students, my research partners, my friends in Shanghai, whose early years coincide with the shortages, family separations, and political mobilizations of the 60s and 70s, but they also shape my own as an American who became politically active with SNCC when a college student, anti-Vietnam War, and then who went to China for the first time in '79 and has continued to go back to China, to work in China, but my life in America has also evolved. And I think, finally, to return to Li's call for leaders in both countries to find a, quote, entirely new way to coexist, I would stress the role of different memories, and in particular, the memories of those who knew life in the 60s and 70s, both in China and the US, and were adults in the 1980s, just as China was emerging onto the global stage, and US citizens could work directly with counterparts for the first time in 30 years. And these are not the memories and experience of most people in either one of the countries. So, in conclusion, I would reinforce Li's argument that Americans must recognize the diversity within Chinese society by emphasizing the importance of remaining attuned to the possibility that generational experience, ambition, and prejudice and fears in both the United States need to be included as we think about the challenges in improving US-China exchange.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. It's all fascinating, all three of your issues. We're now going to turn to Professor Ho, and we are running fairly late at this point. We want to get everything in, so please try and keep your remarks no more than 5 minutes if possible. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie. And first of all, I would like to thank Cheng for your kind invitation to discuss your very important and timely book, and it's a great honor also to join my my distinguished co-panelist. And it's, first of all, I want to say that this is a pleasure to read. This is a great pandemic book. When I was reading the book, I keep thinking about streets of Shanghai, the coffee shops, museums, and even food. Although you didn't talk too much about food, you mostly talk about food security. We haven't been back to China, I think most of us, and I hope that the end of pandemic will come soon, and we'll be back to international travel sooner rather than later. So with that, I would like to share my slides, and I will offer a few perspectives from perhaps a few different angles from my end. First of all, my first reaction reading this book came from myself, and I was a kid from a middle-class family in the southern province of Hunan. So going to Shanghai, visiting a big city was definitely the highlight of one of my summer vacations. So the picture on the left was taken when I was this young kid, looking grumpy because my dad always asked me to smile in front of all the Shanghai, landmarks. But what made the strongest impression was actually when a Shanghai friend took my family to this hot pot restaurant because they think we're from Hunan, we must love hot food. And that was the first time I had Sichuan hot pot in China. That was in the mid 90s. Wasn't very, very popular in my hometown. And I guess that really speaks to Cheng's earlier point, the point about Shanghai culture being inclusive. So that actually was like the most memorable meal. And I keep coming back to Shanghai from time to time. And the picture on the right was taken on a taxi, I think around Xujiahui area. And there are so many very nice coffee shops every year, things are changing. And as you can see, there was this corgi sleeping in front of the porch very leisurely in Shanghai. The air was good. It was a nice summer day. And inside the taxi cab, the taxi driver, I think he was a Shanghai localese, he was humming along the radio that was playing Stevie Wonders. So we were singing Stevie Wonders together in Shanghai. It was a very unique Shanghai experience. My second perspective comes from a consumer of Shanghai art. So Cheng talked a lot about the avant-garde artist, and he also talked briefly about the musical scene. And I do consume a lot of Shanghai music, and perhaps I'll just put in a plug for two groups and two individuals I really like. On the right-hand side, you have Li Quan or James Li. So he is a Shanghai localese, and he's a really well-trained pianist, and he sings jazz, he sings pop songs, and he also sings in English. So if you hear his English song, you probably would have imagined he's coming from New York. And more interestingly, on the left-hand side, there's this newer band which has gained popularity in Chinese. It's called Shanghai 彩虹室内合唱团. So it's the Rainbow Choir. And most of the singers there are part-time singers. They come from different sectors in Shanghai, and they're not your average pop band. They don't sing about their love affairs. They mostly sing about how stressed out millennials are. So this screenshot was taken when they talk about sarcastically how much they like to work overtime. So you got the flavor. All their songs are about the stressed everyday life in urban Shanghai, in urban China, and they became hugely popular because their music really resonates with the rest of a lot of everyday Chinese, their struggles, their lives. So I guess this goes back to Cheng's point about Shanghai culture. They can be upscale, cosmopolitan, but they can also be very down to earth. And I do think that the cultural reach of this high-pi art really goes beyond Shanghai and even middle class. So my next comment would be coming from my hat. I'll take on the hat of political scientist, which I would comment on chapter 6, which is titled From Jiang to Xi, the enduring power and influence of the Shanghai Gan. And I would like to point you to this table on page 154. I have to say that I never think of the Politburo this way. So here we're looking at, for example, in 2017, so that is the current Politburo membership. You see that 3 out of 7 top leaders in China have very significant Shanghai ties. So there are Xi Jinping, Wang Huning, and Han Zheng. And the percentage of Shanghai connection actually, was not as high as the current, the current Standing Bureau Committee. And we can only go back to 1992, where we find such a significant proportion of Shanghai influence. So I guess my question is, what does that mean, right? As we see from the table, Shanghai influence look as strong as in 1992, as in the current moment, and as Cheng talked about, Shanghai high-pi characteristics include openness, diversity. Shanghai individuals are entrepreneurial, cosmopolitan, innovative, inclusive. And I think that's probably all true. On the other hand, we haven't really heard about another Hollywood movie screen in Zhongnanhai. That's also mentioned in the book. And many observers do see a lot of differences in elite politics in the 1990s and in in 2021. I guess if we have time, I would like to hear Cheng talk a little bit more about what does it mean to have 40% Shanghai influence in the Politburo, and I would like to hear what my co-panelists think about this. And my next and final perspective comes from a Chinese person in the U.S. So I was definitely one of the, I was one of the earlier, I guess, students studying in the U.S. before the number picks up, and I remain here. I teach in a U.S. university, but I have to say that the current wave of anti-Asian hate crime is real. It has affected my family members, my friends, and this is a picture taken from a news report. So in the past year, overall hate crime reporting has gone down, but anti-Asian hate crime has gone up more than 100%. And this is probably underreporting. So I think Cheng's book is very timely, very, very timely, because I think what Chinese and Chinese American, Asian American has experienced are real. But I guess the silver lining is that we also see more activism among the Asian group. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Alice and the friends who supported us, and student solidarity during this difficult moment. But I would like to end on a ray of hope. And as Cheng mentioned, U.S.-China relations are not just state-to-state relations; they are really people-to-people relations. And so in the beginning, in the introduction of Cheng's book, he asked the following question: will China's middle class act as a catalyst for positive political transformation? Will it promote a constructive Chinese presence in a changing global environment? And can a solid understanding of their views, values, and voices help reshape U.S.-China engagement? So after I read the book, I think my answers to all three questions are really affirmative, and I think that's really where the book lead me. And I hope readers of the book would also feel optimistic after reading the whole book. And I will end right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And moving quickly right on to Professor Perry for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Jamie mentioned, I was born in Shanghai quite a few years before Cheng was born there, but I was, of course, positively delighted to read this lively and informative book by my fellow Shanghainese about our shared birthplace. And I particularly appreciate his effort to humanize rather than to demonize Chinese society at this particular moment in time. Cheng does, I think, as everyone has mentioned, capture the dynamism of the city. He also provides a wealth of new information, even to those of us who think that we know the city pretty well. And he argues that retaining the goodwill of middle-class Shanghai is essential for preserving a peaceful and productive relationship between our two countries. As someone who has gone back to Shanghai every year since I first returned in 1979 until the pandemic intervened, and as someone who spends all of my sabbaticals based in Shanghai because I love living there and I have so many good friends there, naturally, I enthusiastically support this call for robust bilateral relations built on recognizing the amazing achievements of middle-class Shanghai. But I have to admit that on my last sabbatical to Shanghai in the spring of 2019, I began to feel some real discomfort at realizing that I shared a lot more in common with my colleagues there in Shanghai than I do with many of my fellow Americans, even right here in the state of Massachusetts. I very rarely travel to the rural areas of Massachusetts. I very rarely travel to other rural areas in America, where there are lots of people who feel quite left behind by what has been happening in the dynamic cities that all of us tend to hang out in. I go all the time to Shanghai. I never go to Holyoke, Massachusetts. And when I ventured from Shanghai to Yunnan and Guizhou, as I was doing in 2019 to conduct research on anti-poverty efforts in the remote Chinese countryside, it was equally clear that there is an enormous gulf between Shanghai and other cosmopolitan Chinese cities and the rural poor trying to scrape by in the hinterland. I also was struck by the fact that one of my closest colleagues in China refuses to ever come and visit me in Shanghai. We have to meet somewhere else. And I try to convince him to come. I tell him how welcoming, cosmopolitan, and so forth Shanghai is. And he says, welcoming and cosmopolitan to you, but not to me with my thick Hunan peasant accent. That's the place in China where I'm always discriminated against. So Professor Davis mentioned the embrace of the migrant, but of course we have books like Emily Honig's Creating Chinese Ethnicity that tells us that it was precisely discrimination against the migrants in Shanghai that built the sense of the Shanghainese against the other who came from the poorer parts of China right next door. And my own sense is that a lot of that discrimination against the migrants still persists in Shanghai. In any case, I think that this internal division between the cosmopolitan haves of the urban metropole and the have-nots of the rural periphery has significant political implications in both the US and in China. In America, the resentment of those who felt left behind helped, of course, to fuel Donald Trump's election in 2016 and continues to threaten the very fabric of American democracy. And in China, socioeconomic inequality has been recognized by Xi Jinping himself as a serious threat to his own regime's stability. Both countries also face major internal divisions along lines of race and ethnicity. Middle-class Shanghai is basically Han Chinese, but what about the Uyghurs? And what about the Tibetans in the interior? Or even the Hui living in Ningxia or living in Beijing for that matter. And in the United States, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent upsurge in anti-Asian hate crimes have forced all of us to confront our own deeply entrenched racial prejudices and injustices. In other words, while middle-class China and middle-class America have drawn closer together over the past 40 years through all these wonderful economic and educational and cultural cooperation efforts that Cheng details so well and that I totally applaud and am myself a direct beneficiary of. In the same period, I think we have to admit that we've grown increasingly distant from the less fortunate sectors of our own countries. And that resulting bitterness that we experience domestically not only threatens our domestic political stability, but it also helps to feed this populist anger toward the other country as an adversary that's accused of stealing our jobs or otherwise impeding our own development prospects. Politicians in both of our countries channel anger that's primarily born from internal inequality into expressions of hyper-nationalism that are directed against the other country. And so while I very much agree with Cheng that we need to cooperate, educated middle class to middle class, if you will, on global issues like climate change and public health, I think we also have to find ways to cooperate in acknowledging and sharing solutions to our common internal crises of income inequality, of regional disparity, and of ethnic and racial injustice. These are, of course, highly sensitive, highly politicized issues in both of our countries, but they're not going to be solved by pointing fingers at each other. And I do believe that we, as American scholars of China, have a responsibility to try to encourage this kind of mutual understanding, mutual recognition, mutual cooperation, and mutual learning as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. All of you, you've put a lot on the plate and bringing your particular perspectives to things. we don't have much time at the moment. And so I thought maybe I would pose 2 questions for each of you to respond to that touch on the 2 themes. One, what is going on in China, and what is the particular Shanghai lens that we've been looking at it? Is that valid or not? And the other is how it feeds into the broader US-China relationship. And so the questions would be, if you had to focus on one issue that you would like, or one aspect of China, whether it's Shanghai or Chinese society or China generally, that you would like our policymakers to understand about China, what would that be? And secondly, specifically, what kind of a collaboration would you suggest that we engage in or maintain to try and improve the US-China relationship? And I'm going to start, I guess, in reverse order with Professor Perry, who just finished with sort of thinking about some of these big commonalities, but also a lot of differences that we share. So first, you please.
Okay, so I guess, I would simply suggest that the one issue which I tried to highlight in my comments is a recognition of our parallel shortcomings and problems. And, I totally applaud, as I said, Li Cheng's effort to humanize the dynamism that is going on in China. It's absolutely correct. And I think we have tremendous dynamism in our own society as well, but we also have these really fundamental, in my view, internal social problems in both our countries. And I think recognizing that these are common problems to both of us, that when we're criticizing China's treatment of Uyghurs, for example, we should be very attentive to issues of racial and ethnic injustice within our own society. And so I think in many ways, our domestic problems are very parallel. And the difficulty is that we have trouble recognizing those problems in ourselves. And so we tend to blame them in the other. So I think that's maybe the dark side of the brighter side that Cheng emphasizes in his book, and which I think is also very much a part of this story. So as I said, I think I myself am very drawn to that bright side of China. And I think Cheng does a brilliant job of explaining why it has such attraction and should have such attraction for us. But at the same time, I think my own suggestion would be to recognize these other very serious parallel problems that we share in common as well.
Okay. Professor Ho, if you could also talk about one issue, and then do you have any specific recommendations for what kinds of collaborations or actions that we could take to try and improve our mutual relationship?
Great. Thanks, Jamie. I think I will pick the issue of private sector dynamism. So that's what I work on as a researcher. And now in the US, we do hear a lot of narratives about how the current administration in China is cracking down on the private sector, advancing the state sector. Although I think there are shades of truth in that argument. I wanted to say that the Chinese private sector is still very alive and is growing. And whenever I go back to China, I always try to make visits to different companies, even factories, and to talk to private entrepreneurs. And as Cheng described in his book, not only in Shanghai, in surrounding area, there are many new companies that are doing very innovative stuff. And I do think that with more understanding from both sides, from the business sector, I think people-to-people communication will be better. And maybe a personal anecdote is that now my only interaction with people was outside of my family is with dog owners. And I do have one dog owner friend who said he really wanted to go. He is American. He really wanted to go back to visit Fuzhou. He does business there. He really loved the city. I've never been to Fuzhou, but I I guess, surprised by his urge to go visit China during this difficult period of time. And he talked to me about how great the city was, how the factory he worked with, was open to his idea, etc. So I do think people-to-people exchange happening at many different levels. And in the business sector, you hear about perhaps Elon Musk, I guess Tim Cook talk about what they're doing in China. You do hear a lot of optimism, and I think that's where we could probably put more emphasis on. And I would probably leave the collaboration question to Debbie.
Well, and you've made the point before too that we should keep in mind that a lot of these private entrepreneurs in China can be seen as part of their civil society because they're very active on many fronts. So last but not least, Professor Davis, and then I'm also going to ask Cheng Li to make a few remarks in response to what people have been raising. So first, Professor Davis.
I know I took too much time, so I'm going to try to be especially brief. I totally agree with Liz. In other words, it's the problem piece. We need to both sides need to do a better job of thinking about the other in the context of the disparities within their own country, wealth inequality and racism being number one. And the specific things, the interventions, because you did send it, we've got these folks on the phone call. One, on the American side and working with the Chinese, get the Peace Corps back into China, get the Fulbright program up and running for China, but also I want reciprocity. This is something you and I have talked about, Jamie. By reciprocity, I mean, I want us to do two-sided, or actually and this will be my final recommendation, I want more at least trilateral work. I think one of our problems at the moment, which is creating such difficulty, is it's always bilateral. So the Chinese looking at the Americans, I think we often need a third place. So the specific thing that a program that we should restore and return to is ACLS and LUCE did these programs working with high school teachers, bringing Chinese high school teachers to the United States to do American history. And we also sent American high school teachers to China to do about China. My own initiative, which got cut off by COVID last year, was what I'm calling peer partnerships, and I want them trilateral. And the third party that sprung because of my own background was Germany, so that Americans, Chinese, and Germans would be working intensely on shared problems to get both sides on the US bilateral off their animosities, which I think accelerate in the bilateral.
Okay, thank you so much. And so Cheng, can I give you a few minutes to
sure. Before that, I
just
wanted to thank the speakers on this panel for your excellent, insights, and also very candid criticism. You still have been quite generous. I thought that would be more critical and some of the messages. But I learned a great deal from your perspective. I think what you said all makes sense to me. I'm also struggling to deal with these challenges, those phenomena. It's ongoing. The history of Shanghai has not been written, just like the history of China has not been written. Now, to answer your question, Jimmy, I think that one of my recommendations towards the end, there's a chapter about the recommendation, 5 for US, 5 for China. But there's one, I think it's a common, I think all of the speakers, particularly Liz and Debbie mentioned, is that do not demonize people. I mean, for the US, we constantly now use the term communists, and also in the kind of making enemies, this kind of rhetoric is very, very dangerous. On the China side, I always have been critical about Chinese leaders. They do not want to take universal values. I think this is a major problem. And also that now they talk about the systematic differences. I think these all emphasize differences. But I want to make a point. We should talk about commonalities, similarities. So this is one of the themes. I use the term for middle class just to try to send a message. There are similarities. China's struggle for a modern society to have, enhance the people's livelihood, It's a shared aspiration. Now, I wanted to quote, this is in my book by Jack Ma. He delivered a speech at Shanghai, NYU Shanghai. This is a commencement speech last May, just a year ago. I think that he said the best. He said, I quote, "No people or nation are the same. They are and will continue to be different. Today's global problems are a result of our focus on too many differences. Identifying differences among us is not something to be praised. What is truly praiseworthy is to see through our differences and put faith in our common areas, to have the ability to put aside our differences and work forward together." So particularly issues like economic disparity. Now, China certainly made some progress into poverty elimination or reduction in that area that make the country is relatively good shape. But on the other hand, the racial tensions, we talk about Xinjiang, Tibet, many other things. I mean, talk about the cultural chauvinism. It's not just limited to one country. Many countries face that challenge. So I just want to echo what the three speakers, highlight. So I think that's the point, policy recommendation I will for both governments, and at the moment, particularly for US policymakers. Jamie, back over to you, Jamie.
Thank you. Yes, I was unmuting myself too. So I think actually in this discussion, we've addressed some of the questions that were posed in advance that asked questions, for example, how representative is Shanghai of the rest of China? In many ways it is, in other ways it's not. As you pointed out in your book, Cheng, in a way, America is similar to Shanghai. We're both relatively new places. We're immigrant places built on immigrants and struggling with the kinds of issues that Liz and Debbie also raised as well. So we do share a lot of these commonalities, but there are distinct differences, and I would say particularly at the elite politics level, national versus people-to-people kinds of relations. And I guess I'd like to ask, how would you all respond to the idea that by strengthening and working with China's middle class or Chinese society generally through educating them and all the work we do in China, are we simply strengthening, the Xi Jinping regime at the expense of American interests? And how do you reconcile this kind of diversity and dynamism that everybody's been talking about with the increased ideological conformity that we see coming out of Xi Jinping's China, and which is giving rise to so much of the concern on the US side? So how do we, explain what we're trying to do through people-to-people exchanges will have an impact at the top? Even with the Shanghai people up there, we're seeing them moving in a direction that does not seem to be reflective of the Shanghai high values. So Debbie, you want to start?
Right. So I commented on your question, which is, I think the national value is, to avoid war, national interests, and to have, a lower the temperature. And I actually think the people, peer-to-peer is an ideal way to build that kind of social resilience in both countries. So this is this peer-to-peer. And when I mean peer-to-peer, I mean that. So I am not focused, because, middle class is not a term I like to use because it's too broad. What I mean is those people who have shared expertise. So it's people who are working, the particular thing I was doing was plastic in the ocean. And, in other words, you find these topics and there is the option. And the other piece, why I feel more positive than many people, is that what is different in 2021 now from 1979 when Liz and I went there. I wasn't even born, not even to mention 1992, 95 was peers. So when we had crises in the mid-90s, I had relatively few peers, and neither did other people in other sectors. Now we have that, and it's all over China. That I actually don't, whereas I love Shanghai, it is special. I think this aspect of initiatives there. And so my fieldwork was in Yunnan, in poverty counties, and we immediately connected. And then another one was in 3 years ago in Henan, in the third tier city. And, you know, within 2 or 3 days, there was a person and a group. We were talking about shared problems. And so that's also my bent, is find a shared problem. And since there's so many problems, particularly in the United States, it's not hard for me to identify areas where I think people-to-people, small-scale initiatives can really make a difference.
How about other panelists? Yuan, do you have any comments?
I think Liz unmuted. Do you want to go first?
Either way, I just wanted to echo Debbie's comment, and of course the main theme of Cheng's book, which is the importance of these peer-to-peer connections. You know, frankly, I think we can't worry too much about whether our openness and our desire to engage is going to strengthen Chinese authoritarianism. That's for Chinese to worry about. I worry about American authoritarianism. And I think it's crucial to our own sense of development to maintain this openness, to figure out what's going on in China, to be very aware and connected to these very dynamic developments within China for our own sake, and to make sure that we're not left behind. So I totally echo the point that Debbie made, and that Cheng makes in his book as well, that we should restart the Fulbright program. My backdrop here is the Harvard Yenjing Institute, which this year is collaborating with several other foundations in the US, the Luce Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Carnegie and Rockefeller Brothers, to provide some funding to step in, but only for 1 year can we do it as American civil society, to show how important we think it is to restart educational exchanges of the sort that Fulbright used to support between the US and China, for our own sake. And hopefully it will have benefits for China as well. But I don't see this as a missionary project that basically is intended to save China from authoritarianism. I really view it as an effort that is essential for America to be true to its own values.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. Yes. Sure. Yeah. So I feel very energized, you know, by Debbie and Liz's comment, and I also, in the same way, I feel energized when I hear my students in my Chinese politics class. So their backgrounds are from Chinese or mostly American middle class family, and when I hear the exchanges, I could see that they understand each other more. And in the end, I feel everybody's learning from each other, and more understanding always improve, I think, mutual bilateral relations. So I definitely think that, you know, students studying each other's country is a great way to improve bilateral relations. I hope that continues.
Well,
okay.
If I may, I just
yes,
make a very quick point. I think the panelists really have excellent points. You know, I agree everything has been said. I only just want to add one thing. When we started that relationship, you know, 40, 50 years ago, and we know that HPBS has a good story about the Philadelphia Symphony in Beijing. And we talk about ping pong diplomacy, you know, 50 years ago. When Deng Xiaoping and the President Jimmy Carter started educational exchanges, you know, 40-some years ago, I mean, in their mind, ultimately, this educational culture exchange can bring peace, bring mutual understanding. So the stake is so high, we should not lose that big picture. If we lose that leverage, this people-to-people, you know, friendship or contact. Now, we do not need to agree everything, but also, I mean, so-called changing China. I think Chinese people, we should have confidence. Ultimately, they will make right choice, right decision. But we should provide our good example, our goodwill, rather than just wanted to contain China, defeat China, make another kind of Cold War kind of ending. You can see China will resist, people will surround the government, will support the authoritarian leadership. So that's the background. So I just want to add at this point.
No, that's excellent. And we've run over a little bit, but I think this has been a very, very rich discussion. And we all thank you, Cheng, for this wonderful book that raised these issues. And I've been thinking, President Biden has declared that his foreign policy should be to benefit our middle class. And our middle class is shrinking while China's is growing at this time. But we do share a lot of commonalities, not just the middle class, but society generally. And we're all in this together. And I think the discussion today illustrates how important it will be for all of us and our decision makers to keep in mind exactly what you've all said, that we're all engaged in self-strengthening and maintaining security at home, but also trying to ensure a conducive, beneficial international environment as well. And I think that this admittedly unique Shanghai window into the complexity and the dynamism of Chinese society generally is an important, and remember the impact that US-China engagement has had. The two-way impact for both of our countries is very important as we work forward to figure out the right mix of the policy on confrontation, competition, and cooperation. I think all of us hope we focus a lot more on the cooperative element than the others that have been highlighted at the beginning. But again, we thank you all for joining us today. Brookings for hosting this, Cheng for writing another fabulous book, and wish you all good day. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.